All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the Moose Family Speaker Series today. First, some logistics. We expect a good number of folks streaming in from around the country, so we welcome you to use the chat to tell us who you are, where you're streaming from, and one reason water matters to you. Please also use the chat to submit questions throughout today's webinar. Make sure your chat is sent to everyone using the drop-down bar directly above the chat box. To give ample time for our panel discussion, today's webinar will run until 1:30. We have turned on closed captioning. You can hide it by clicking on the live transcript button. My name is Valerie Forbes, and I am the Dean of the University of Minnesota's College of Biological Sciences. I'm also a member and former chair of the board at Freshwater, a Minnesota nonprofit on a mission to inspire and empower people to value and preserve water. Since 1968, Freshwater has been a leading public nonprofit organization that uses science to engage communities from small towns to the capital on how to equitably improve water today for future generations. Today, it's our pleasure to host the Moose Family Speaker Series on water resources, a lecture series named after the late Malcolm Moose, president of the University of Minnesota from 1967 to 1974. Freshwater and CBS have partnered together for years to bring cutting-edge science on water from around the world to new audiences. Before I introduce Dr. Brahney, please join me in thanking all of our generous sponsors for making this program possible today. I'd like to give a special thank you to today's leading sponsors, including Metropolitan Council, fostering efficient and economic growth for a prosperous Twin Cities region, Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, improving and protecting Minnesota's water and soil resources by working in partnership with local organizations and private landowners. Minnesota Department of Health, committed to building up health equity in Minnesota so that all communities can thrive. Minnesota Environmental Quality Board, a forum for leadership and coordination across Minnesota state agencies on complex priority environmental issues. And Environmental Working Group, a national nonprofit dedicated to empowering people with research for informed choices, healthy lives, and a healthy environment. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Janice Brahney. Dr. Janice Brahney is an associate professor at Utah State University. She received her doctorate in environmental biogeochemistry from the University of Colorado Boulder and holds a master's degree in earth science and a bachelor's degree in environmental science, both from Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, Canada. Her research sits at the intersection of atmosphere and earth, focusing on how the atmosphere is a pathway for materials to enter surface waters, as well as the cause, effect, and mitigation of water quality impairment. Much of Dr. Brahney's work has produced results with far-reaching implications for policy, land use regulation, and ecosystem monitoring. Her research has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, Scientific American, and NPR. And she has been a guest on several podcasts, including Big Picture Science and Quirks and Quarks. Dr. Brahney is currently an associate editor for Freshwater Science. Dr. Brahney, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm very excited to be here, even if I'm a little dismayed about the topic. So I'm going to be talking about why is it raining plastic? So I am an accidental plastic researcher, as are many plastic researchers. I'm very interested in how humans destabilize surface soils, which leads to the production of dust, which then gets transported to remote mountain ecosystems, particularly freshwater ecosystems. So I'm very interested in material transport through the atmosphere and its implications. One of the challenges of studying atmospheric particulates is that we don't do a very good job of monitoring what's in the atmosphere. We have excellent monitoring programs for gases, for precipitation chemistry, and for really fine particles, those particles that are less than 10 microns, which is just a hair larger, than a red blood cell. And these really fine particulates are typically generated through industrial activities, but dust particles tend to be much, much larger. So that means the bulk of the mass of material that is in the atmosphere is much larger than what we monitor, which means that we don't really know what's in the atmosphere. And this seems like a really significant data and knowledge gap. So I really wanted to start filling this data gap. So I partnered with the National Atmospheric Deposition Program. This is an organization that monitors precipitation chemistry across North America at over 300 stations every single week. What you see on the left is a very standard NADP, or National Atmospheric Deposition Program, monitoring station. Now on this table, you see two different buckets. One has a lid on it. And when it starts to rain, this triggers a sensor that moves the lid from the rain bucket over onto the dry bucket. And that way rain is collected into the rain bucket. And there's a heater on the sensor. So when it stops raining, the heater evaporates the water and the lid moves back over to cover the rain bucket. Now, using this type of sampler ensures that the rain is collected without any particulate deposition that happens under a beautiful sunny day, like in this picture. Now, the NADP wasn't doing anything with this dry bucket, so this seemed like a perfect opportunity for me to capitalize on this wonderful network and develop a sampler that can fit into this bucket. And this is what I did. So we can't just take the sample out of the bucket without a sampler, because there could be all kinds of contamination from birds or bugs, and because winds can come along and re-excavate anything that's in the bucket, removing some of the fine particulates. So I developed a sampler that acts as a wind baffle, so it prevents that type of wind excavation and also prevents contamination. I did a number of field and lab tests to ensure that it works. And then we started a pilot study across the American West at 11 different stations. Now, all of these sites are in remote areas. So they're all in national parks or in wilderness areas, some high up on mountains, some in plains. And I began to sample the particulate deposition in all size ranges monthly for dry deposition and weekly for wet deposition. So through the normal protocol of the NADP, they collect their precipitation sample every week, and then they filter it and they measure that dissolved fraction in the filter, and then they would send me the filter so that I can quantify what's on that particles on the filter. So since I was really interested in what dust is made out of and how it potentially influences these remote aquatic ecosystems, I started to look at it under the microscope. And the first thing I saw was a blue fiber. And my first reaction was, oh no, I've contaminated my sample. But then as I scrolled through the sample, I saw plastics in every shape and color and size, many different microbeads, all kinds of different particles from different commodities, fibers of every different color and size and shape and texture. And I realized there's no way that this was contamination, that in fact my samples are full of plastic. And this was back in 2017. I had never heard of plastic deposition or plastic in the atmosphere, and I was absolutely surprised. So how did we get to this point in our history where plastic is literally falling out of the sky? So this graph can help us understand that a little bit. This is showing the plastic production over the last 70 years or so. We've actually been producing plastic for over 100 years, but it has only really been since 1950 that production has started to increase exponentially. production is increasing by roughly 4% every year, and it's estimated that to date, we've produced about 10 billion metric tons of plastic. It's also estimated that 12 to 18% of that annual production doesn't get incinerated, doesn't make it to a landfill, but ends up in our environment and in our ecosystems. So that's equivalent to about 1 billion metric tons of plastic waste that is in our environment. One of the wonderful things about plastic and why we need it and why we use it is that plastic is really resilient. It's made to resist the biodegradation. It's meant to resist breaking down. So instead of decomposing into its base element, instead it fragments into smaller and smaller pieces in the environment until finally it's small enough to be transported by wind. So this image on the right is a typical dust sample where this is the width of this image is less than 1 millimeter. So you can see how very tiny these pieces of plastic are, definitely not visible to the naked eye. So I recognized that with this sampling design that I had set up, that I was in a really good position to start answering some key questions about plastic in the atmosphere. Because I was isolating how much is falling out with rain and how much was falling out dry, I could start to answer questions not only about this new pollution source, but how plastic is falling out of the sky. Where is it coming from? How far is it traveling? What commodities are contributing to deposition? So what products are we seeing in the atmospheric fallout? And can we determine how plastic gets into the atmosphere to begin with? So this is a little bit different than how plastic enters the environment, but how is plastic getting from the surface Earth into the atmosphere where it can be transported? So tackling this very first question, how much plastic is falling out of the sky? And does it matter if it's coming out with rain or if it's coming out dry? So rain scavenging is what happens when under a rainstorm, where all the rain will basically clear and wash whatever's out of the atmosphere underneath that cloud base, whereas dry deposition can occur from anywhere in the atmospheric column. So in order to do this, I very painstakingly measured and quantified over 15,000 pieces of plastic in our 11 sites for monthly dry deposition and weekly wet deposition. And I did this from late 2017 until early 2019. I calculated the size or measured the size, the width of particles, and I also classified them as either primary or secondary microplastics. So a primary microplastic is a piece of plastic that was created in that very small size, like a microbead. Whereas a secondary microplastic is a piece of plastic that has shed from a much larger pieces of plastic, like fibers from your clothing or pieces of your cell phone case that have broken down over time. And I used this information to calculate a deposition rate in terms of the number of particles per meter square per time. And because I had detailed information on the size and the volume, I could calculate the mass of deposition. I also used a technique, a spectroscopic technique, to identify the different types of polymers that were present. So what types of plastic? This image on the left is from a microbead that we picked up that's on the tip of a tweezers that we actually had to shave down so that it was small enough that we could pick up these tiny pieces of plastic. And as you can imagine, this was quite challenging. And we were able to identify some individual pieces with the spectra that you see on the right. But luckily, we also were able to use this technique where we could mass identify particles. So I could take my dust sample and have it identify hundreds of pieces of hundreds of particles at a time, so I could determine how much of that dust sample was organic, was mineral, or was plastic. Okay, so looking at our results over a 14-month period, we saw a range in plastic deposition rates in these really remote locations by about an order of magnitude. So the lowest deposition rate was in Canyonlands at about 48 pieces of plastic per meter square per day. So every single day, about 50 pieces of plastic are falling onto a meter squared area. The highest deposition rate was in Rocky Mountain National Park, where we quantified about 435 pieces of plastic per meter square per day. Now, I mentioned all of our sites were in remote locations. So Rocky Mountain National Park was actually closest to an urban center, about 50 kilometers, but some of our sites were up to 300 kilometers from a major urban center. So I wanted to calculate about how much plastic was falling on our remote protected areas in the West. So these are just the dark green and the light green areas in the 11 most Western states. And I calculated that that was about 1,000 to 4,000 tons annually. Now, to help you visualize that, that's about 100 to 400 million water bottles, or about 2,000 elephants, and that's every single year. If I were to take this average deposition rate in these remote areas of 132 particles per meter square per year and extrapolated that over the entire United States, we would get a rate of 22,000 tons per year, but that is likely a severe underestimate, and I'll get into why that is in a little bit. So using this particle mapping technique that I was telling you about, we were able to determine within our samples about how much of that sample was plastic. So anywhere between 2 and 6%, an average of 4% of atmospheric dust is plastic. That is a huge number when we consider the amount of material that actually moves through the atmosphere. So I've highlighted in here red these different pieces of plastic that might be a little hard to pick out from this image. I also highlighted in yellow tire wear particles, which we have quantified, but we haven't yet published. And you'll notice that there's about half as many tire particles as there are pieces of plastic. Okay, so can we use this information that we collected to tell how far the plastic is traveling through the atmosphere? And so I used a number of different techniques to try to answer this question. The first was running what we call back trajectory models. So an example image is shown here. So for a sampling date of June 25th, 2018, we ran a model based on the known atmospheric condition at the time to see where that air mass had been in the previous 48 hours. So the 2 days before arriving at our site, the air mass moved through southwestern Wyoming before entering Colorado and arriving at our site. So we created a buffer around that path and then determined how many times an air mass interacted with a major urban center, or what the total population that air mass intersected with before it arrived at our site. We also looked at things like wind speed and total land covered. And we used some data from the samples themselves to help us understand what the source might be, like the total mass of dust in the sample, or different ions like sodium and chloride that could help us determine whether or not this was perhaps a marine source. In addition, I wanted to try to understand how large-scale climate patterns like the location of the jet stream might be influencing plastic deposition. And what we found was really interesting, and that's that wet deposition, so the plastics that come out of the sky with rain, had very different drivers than dry deposition. For wet deposition, we did find a correlation to the intersection of these air masses with major urban centers. So for example, our highest wet deposition recorded was at Rocky Mountain National Park in one particular week, where we recorded over 300 pieces of plastic per meter square per day. And during that week, 4 of the 7 days had air masses that first passed through the Denver-Fort Collins area before arriving at our site with very high wind speeds. Our lowest wet deposition was recorded in Grand Canyon during a week where wind speeds were very slow. You can see these individual 48-hour air mass trajectories didn't travel very far, so the winds weren't moving fast, and none of them intersected with major urban centers. During that week, we saw a deposition rate of only 5 plastics per meter square per day. So note that we still saw plastic deposition, but it was at a much reduced rate. The other thing that we found with wet deposition is that there was a very strong positive correlation to the amount of dust that we saw in the sample. And so that was really interesting to us and suggested that plastics are spiraling through the environment. So they could have some atmospheric lifetime, get deposited onto a soil surface, then get picked up again by winds with that soil, remobilized to a new location, and get deposited again. And we think that this is also a really good indication that agricultural systems might be contributing to a lot of atmospheric plastics. And this is because ag soils are going to have a much greater plastic concentration than wildland soils. And this is for 2 primary reasons. One is that plastic mulch is used quite frequently in agricultural practices. And 2, biosolids produced in this country, about 50% of all the biosolids are applied as agricultural fertilizer. And so that means all the fibers that leave our homes, that go down our drains and into the wastewater stream, arrive at wastewater treatment plants, which are very effective at retaining those plastics in the solid fraction, which then gets converted into fertilizer and then applied to the landscape. And so that's a very direct route of our waste from our homes entering into the environment. And then of course, there are different ways that agricultural practices can assist with the emission of soils to the atmosphere. So what we think is happening here is that during a rainstorm, as depicted on the right, there's a lot of turbulence, which has the capacity to pick up materials from the ground surface, including soils and plastics, pull them up into the clouds, which then get rained out at our sites. And we, in fact, noticed that our plastics that fell out of the sky with a rainstorm tended to be much larger in size than the plastics that came out of the sky under dry conditions. So this tells us that they're being sourced more proximally. So from these nearby urban centers or from nearby soils where these storm fronts are picking up that material and transporting it not a very far distance and then having them fall out with rain. We saw very different relationships with dry deposition. The first thing we noticed is that dry deposition is much smaller in size. So here's the distribution of size ranges on the left, and you can see that dry deposition, the medium size, is about an order of magnitude smaller than what we saw in wet deposition. So this is a first indication that dry deposition is coming from much further away. We also found that there was a very positive association with dry deposition and elevation. So the higher in elevation we went up a mountain range, the more dry plastic deposition we saw. And this suggests that plastics are moving high in the atmosphere and intersecting with mountain ranges where they're being deposited. Finally, we also noticed that the location of the jet stream played a really strong role in the dry deposition rate, but not the wet deposition rate. So if the if the jet stream dipped really far south, as you see in this picture here, and intersected with our sites, we tended to see a much greater deposition rate than if the jet stream was moving north of our sites. And so just to illustrate a little bit about the differences here, what comes out with rain is what's in the atmosphere below the cloud base. And so this is in the turbulent planetary boundary layer. It's coming from much closer in source, whereas what's traveling much higher in the troposphere is what's falling out dry, and it's coming from much further away. So I don't want to suggest that plastics are in the jet stream. We don't know that. But the location of the jet stream influences the air mass patterns higher up in the atmosphere, and we did see a relationship with that. Okay, So what commodity sources are contributing to the plastics that we see falling out of the sky? Well, most of what we saw were fibers, and this is pretty common to a lot of different environments where we see plastic pollution, that we dominantly see fibers. Most of these were polyester. We also saw some nylon and a few other very common clothing types. Often we talk about technical clothing shedding a lot of microplastics, but polyester is really everyday clothing. We also quantified that about 30% of the particles, or 10% of all the plastic pieces, were primary microbeads. I was always a little excited whenever I found a microbead because of the range of colors. They were really difficult to identify using FTIR because they were often smaller than the aperture size of our FTIR. But we were able to corral a few together and identify some, and we found that they were dominantly acrylic, which suggests to us that they might be coming from paints. And if we look at the manufacturers of these brightly colored microbeads and these size fractions, they do in fact sell to paint companies. And so we think this might be one of the sources of atmospheric plastics. Okay, so last question, can we determine the major sources of plastic to the atmosphere? So again, this is not plastics to the environment, but this is how are plastics getting from the ground surface high enough into the atmosphere where they can be transported long distances. And to do this, I partnered with Dr. Natalie Mahawald at Cornell, who's an atmospheric modeler, so that we could try to understand what the ultimate source of plastic was that we quantified as deposition. And so in order to do this, we came up with 5 different hypotheses about how plastics can enter the atmosphere using our understanding of how dust enters the atmosphere, because we're really looking at the same particle size ranges and similar densities. And so our 5 different hypothesized sources were urban areas, highways, agricultural activities, the ocean environments, and what we call population dust, which I'll explain. And then we could use the model, run the model during the time period, the 14 months under which I determined the deposition rates, and use the model to see which of our hypothesized sources best explained our deposition. So I'm going to go through these 5 different hypothesized sources based on the strength of our results. So what we determined to be the most important sources to the atmosphere. So the first was the marine source. And this was most important globally, which is not altogether surprising given how long we've been polluting the marine environment with plastics. So we know that the marine environment does produce a lot of atmospheric aerosols through what we call bubble burst phenomena and through wave action that can create a lot of aerosols and emit them into the atmosphere where they can get picked up and transported far. And because plastics are often less dense than water, they float on the water surface and break down through wave action and through photochemistry into smaller and smaller pieces. And so then these really tiny microplastics are on the ocean surface available to be turned into aerosol. What was kind of surprising to us was that through the atmosphere, we saw more plastics moving from ocean to land than land to ocean. And so initially, I think we all would have thought that the land is ultimately a source of plastic to the ocean through the atmosphere. But we've been polluting the ocean environment for so long, for 70 years it's been accumulating plastic, that the amount of plastics we produce in any one year is really dwarfed by the 70 years of accumulation in the marine environment. So when we think about it from a historical context, yes, it does make sense that we have the ocean environment really literally spitting pollution back onto the terrestrial environment. Our next most important source were roads, and really the most important source in the terrestrial environment. Now I've got an image on the left showing a car driving over a dirt road to illustrate the process of what's happening. As car tires move over the road surface, that produces a lot of friction that gives the material that's on the surface of the road enough energy to be emitted high into the atmosphere where it can be transported long distances. This, of course, also produces tire wear particles. But if you were to pick up road dust in any city, or in fact, probably anywhere, if you looked at road dust under the microscope, you would see all kinds of different plastic from a variety of different commodity sources. So we've basically got plastics everywhere, and cars driving on highways is just a very effective mechanism to move that plastic from the surface of the earth high into the atmosphere. The third next most important source was agriculture. We've already talked a little bit about why agricultural soils will tend to have higher plastic concentrations. And of course, agricultural practices, particularly in the West, can lead to a lot of dust generation. Here in the West, we're in semi-arid climates or arid climates. And of course, there are periods of time when agricultural soils are fallow, where wind speeds can induce the mobilization of soil and plastic in that soil, which tends to be less dense, into the atmosphere. So this is the result from the global model. And notice that most of what we see globally is not where we were sampling. And so this is an important point for me to bring up, is that we are taking data from a very small part of the globe and extrapolating that across the globe. And that is a huge extrapolation. We're taking conditions that we see in the Western United States and applying them across the globe. But what it does tell us is something about what we might expect to find, where we should be focusing our efforts, what the dominant sources are. It gives us a lot of hypotheses to test and gives us really a framework from which to try to understand where we need to move next. Also, I'd like to highlight for anyone interested in doing this type of work is that in order for the data to be used in a model, it needs to be collected at a relatively high frequency, and the size fractions of the particles need to be quantified so that we can start to use all the data that's been being collected across the United States or globally in models like this to better refine them. So the fourth most important source, which was not very important in our area at all, but potentially really important globally, is this term population dust. And what that really means is that there are natural dust producing areas across the globe. We have deserts and semi-arid regions that naturally produce a lot of dust. If those dust producing regions happen to be close to really dense population centers, then there's a lot of potential for that dust to contain a lot of the waste from those population centers. So this is what we mean by population dust. And again, you can see this wasn't very important in our study area, but could be a really important source globally, and that would be an important hypothesis to test. What was initially really surprising to us is that cities didn't come out as important at all in the model. And we think this is for a couple of reasons. One is that probably the effect of highways was way more important, and so that dwarfed the effects of the cities, so that it didn't come out as important. But also, notice this picture on the left. Urban centers have a lot of buildings, and that can really disrupt airflow. It can prevent the wind from actually reaching the ground surface to pick up material and have it transported far. And so really what we need is the ability to move plastics high enough into the atmospheric column where they can be traveled long distance. There's no doubt that urban centers have a lot of plastic in their ambient atmosphere, similar to the way that urban centers have a lot of dust in their atmosphere. So on the right, I'm just illustrating an example where in urban centers, we do tend to see a lot of dust material. Here we see in Boulder, Colorado, a deposition rate of 20 grams per meter square per year. In some places, like here in Utah, it's an order of magnitude higher. In urban centers, it's about 200 grams per meter square per year. But if you were to travel just a mile outside of the urban center, those rates would drop to 5 to 6 grams per meter square per year. And so this is this urban atmosphere effect. It's creating a lot of pollution, it's creating a lot of particles, but they're not getting emitted high into the atmosphere, so they're not getting transported far outside of that urban center. Okay, so if we take all of these sources together, we can arrive at our first approximation of the total microplastic deposition throughout the globe and where we would anticipate seeing the greatest deposition rates and the lightest deposition rates. Now notice that all the areas I sampled were the most remote areas in the United States. That's actually where we would expect to see the lowest deposition rates. So this is why my initial extrapolation is most likely a really significant underestimate. The other thing I'd like to point out is that there's likely no area on the globe that does not experience some level of microplastic deposition. And what's really unsettling to me is that we don't fully understand the implications of this deposition. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the ongoing work. So now that we understand a little bit more about plastic deposition rates, we want to move on to understand what are some of the implications of plastic deposition. So I have been continuing this work and I have been quantifying plastic deposition through the last few years. And as you can see, since my initial study in 2018 and 2019, actually beginning in 2017, we've seen a really significant increase in plastic deposition. On the left here, I'm quantifying it by area because I'm actually interested in what the total area of plastic deposition might be. I've also been quantifying the colors because I'm really interested in how plastic might influence the absorption of solar radiation. Now, I stopped collecting wet deposition in 2019, so this is only dry deposition, which is an underestimate to some extent because in our initial study, we determined that anywhere between 8 and 44% of the deposition of plastic can be come in wet. And I have not yet included tires in this estimate, although I am almost done counting and measuring this portion. So where I'm going with this is that I partnered with Mackenzie Skiles, who used the snow, ice, and aerosol radiative transfer model so that we can understand what the potential impact of microplastic deposition are on snow melt. Since plastics are colored, they have the capacity to absorb solar radiation, which means they have the capacity to accelerate snow melt. So through, this is for one site, through our 3 different years of quantification where we see a very substantive increase in deposition rate through time, you can see the mean effect on the radiation balance. And we also quantified a minimum and a maximum based on the color of microplastics. So this was our initial approach. We defined the minimum as light gray microplastics and the maximum as blue microplastics. And you can see that that accelerated melt anywhere from 4% up to 27%. So that's a pretty significant change in the rate at which snow melts. Our next step is to consider tire wear particles. Tire wear particles are black in color, so they absorb significantly more solar radiation, but the deposition rate is, we quantified, lower than the plastic deposition rate. It's about 50% of the plastic deposition rate. So this is our next step in trying to understand the effect on snow melt. Our next study, which we are getting ready to start this summer, is to see whether or not we can identify the age of plastics that's falling out of the atmosphere. And really by age, it's in quotations because I mean photochemical age. We can expose plastics to radiation and observe how they change through time so that we can try to define a degree of degradation as it relates to exposure to the sun. And we're going to do this both in the field and in the lab. So in the field, we're exposing 5 polymer types to solar radiation, both outside of water and within water. And then in the lab, we're using light emitting photoreactors using a laser to really accelerate the photoaging process. So this laser has the capacity to age plastic in a year, by a year in just a short amount of time. So we can then periodically take measurements with our FTIR to see how that plastic is changing and also identify the formation of what we are calling, or what are called, polar functional groups. So if as these polar groups form on the plastic, virgin plastic is typically hydrophobic, But as these polar functional groups form, it can become hydrophilic. It changes how these plastics respond and behave in the environment. So by measuring these photo-aged plastics through time, we can hopefully come up with a mechanism to identify the age of plastics in the atmosphere and how long they've been bouncing around the Earth's surface, or how long they've been spiraling through our Earth system. And lastly, our final project, which we are hoping to do if it gets funded, is to expand our plastic deposition sampling program across the entire United States. And here we'd like to target more than just remote locations. We'd like to include agricultural areas, industrial areas, coastal areas, and urban areas. And we want to use some novel techniques to measure both fluxes to the atmosphere as well as deposition from the atmosphere, so we can quantify both the source flux as well as the deposition rate. And this is with a number of different collaborators across the country, including Dr. Natalie Mahowald at Cornell, Dr. Kim Prather at Scripps, and Drs. Kim Hageman and Randy Martin here at USU. Dr. Kim Prather has a wind wave tunnel where we would like to use microplastics to determine how and what types of microplastics are able to turn into aerosols from marine wave and bubble burst phenomena, and how those plastics influence the chemistry of aerosol emissions and microbial processes on the surface of the ocean. And then to understand how the particles that are formed, whether or not they can act as ice condensation nuclei in the atmosphere. So do they have the capacity to influence the hydrologic cycle, for example? And we also want to incorporate all the data we're taking on radiation absorption by these different polymers and how they age, and synthesize all of this information to an Earth system model to understand the emission, the transport, the deposition, and the effect on the physics and chemistry of the atmosphere. So if we're lucky, this project will get funded. And with that, I am more than happy to take any questions. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm very happy to be here.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brahney. We really appreciate you sharing your insights. That is some very cool research, disturbing, but very cool. Viewers, we'll ask you to please continue to submit your questions to the chat, and we'll now shift to the panel Q&A portion of today's program. So our panelists today include Dr. Elizabeth Miner, professor at the University of Minnesota-Duluth. She holds a doctorate in marine chemistry and geochemistry. She joined the Large Lakes Observatory in 2005, and her research focuses on carbon cycling in aquatic systems. Dr. Miner looks at the organic material that gets eaten in lake systems, the inorganic carbon released by respiration and fixed with photosynthesis, and how these interact. Now that plastic microfibers are being found in water, in sediment, and in fish stomachs, Dr. Miner and her lab are working to measure the amount of smaller plastic particles in the environment so that toxicologists can use the data in their studies. Our second panelist, Wayne Gjerde, is the Recycling Market Development Coordinator with Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. He consults with startup and expanding companies in the areas of finance, new product development, business plan development, sales, and marketing. He's also done extensive work in economic analysis, linking the environment and economy, and he's spoken at many local and national recycling events. With more than 40 years of experience, Mr. Gjerde has worked in the private and public sectors and is a current board member of the National Recycling Coalition. So welcome, panelists. I see that the freshwater team has been accumulating lots of questions here while we've been talking, and I just need to find them. Oh, we've even got categories of questions. So let us start. I'm going to assume that the freshwater team has been accumulating these in the order that they would like me to ask them. So with that assumption, The first series of questions kind of focuses on the difference between large pieces of plastic versus microplastics in dust and water. And the first question is anyone developing standard methods to measure concentrations of microplastics in water and air? And that may be, Janice, if you want to start, and then we can open up to either of our other panelists. So standard methods.
Sure. Yes, I know that the state of California has been working hard to develop standard methods for measuring microplastics in drinking water. I'll let Elizabeth speak to any other regulations or standards that might be in place. As for the atmosphere, no, we do not have standard methods for quantifying atmospheric microplastics. And that is because there are a lot of challenges with the measurement. Often we measure atmospheric aerosols using samplers that specifically filter out very tiny particles and are not very good at capturing the full amount of particles that are in the atmosphere. And because plastics tend to be a strange shape and size, their aerodynamics, or the physics of how these particles move through the atmosphere, make it very difficult for us to develop these types of methods. And so that's why I focused mainly on deposition and gravitational fallout of plastic, which is on its way to being a standard method with the NADP, but not yet.
Okay, Elizabeth, you want to add anything?
So I can talk a little further about the California study because I'm actually involved in it. And so that study took 26 different labs throughout the world and gave them all the same suite of test microplastics and had us see how we did with different size ranges. And the answer is we didn't do all that well, but we're working on it. And we do better for intermediately sized microplastics rather than the really small or the really large ones. And by taking this information, we're getting a much better understanding of what's practical in terms of doing microplastics measurements in both drinking water and in natural waters. And the recommendations for that are on their way toward being spread throughout the microplastics community. The papers are in press or submitted in that case.
All right, we'll look forward to those. Thank you. The next question is about sinks, and wondering if anyone has identified any globally significant sinks for atmospheric plastics. And if not, and I guess this is primarily for you, Janice, have you quantified future accumulation in the atmosphere at current or increasing plastic production rates?
We've done a little bit of future work, but it's highly speculative, and we were reticent to publish that because we really just need a lot more information than what we have at the moment. So as I was mentioning, we have really high temporal spatial resolution for a small area across the globe, and given that we're seeing really constantly increasing deposition rates, we just really need a lot more information to make that estimate. In terms of sinks, sediments are a sink for plastics in the ocean environment and lake environments. Those are certainly sinks when we think about the global perspective. And Elizabeth, you might have a little more to add there.
I also wanted to mention that there is the sink that some microplastic actually gets fully oxidized into carbon dioxide, so it turns into something different. And then also in ocean studies, folks have found that bacteria can actually take the dissolved material from off of plastic particles and ingest and use it to make more of their own biomass and to respire. So those are ways to take what was a plastic polymer or monomer and change it into something completely different.
Yeah, and I think I would add that it's also important to recognize that that sink is relatively small compared to the amount of plastic waste that we already have in the environment and that we produce in any given year.
The rates are very slow.
Very, very slow.
So I want to chime in here and just caution, as someone who spent a good part of their career studying organisms that eat sediment, I'm not sure I would consider sediment a sink for plastics. I think they can be ingested by invertebrates that live on the bottom of the seafloor. And I think we have no idea what happens once the plastics are ingested by those critters, but you could imagine that there's the potential for food chain effects. I think it's just early days. All right, well, thank you. This one, next one is related to wildfires and how might heavy wildfires in a region alter the transfer and deposition of microplastics. And the participant is thinking particularly about the 2020 wildfires out west in particular.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so we actually did a study through the wildfire season to look at the composition of deposition and how that changed. We didn't really see any changes in plastic deposition. You know, you might anticipate that in the areas where fire is happening, it could incinerate a lot of the plastics, but also what tends to happen are really strong updrafts. And so a lot of material can get emitted pretty high into the atmosphere during fires. And if those fires are moving through urban areas in particular, there's a lot of opportunities for plastics to get emitted into the atmosphere that way.
Okay, either of our other panelists want to weigh in?
Just to mention that once you've had a fire on a landscape, it's really easy to mobilize the surface sediment, the surface soil that's on top of it. And so you end up getting more transport into rivers and streams quite often until you get ground cover again.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Questions are still coming in and being reorganized here. I want to give Wayne a chance to jump in here. And I think this one is maybe one for primarily for you, Wayne. So it is about for Minnesota and in particular the Twin Cities metro area. Is it true that much of our recycled plastic, so put into the curbside recycling programs, ultimately ends up in a landfill? Is that something?
Well, the short answer is no. So if it makes it into your curbside bin, we recycle about 77,000 tons of plastic from our curbside. So that goes to plastic lumber, it may go to carpet, it may go to a variety of places. Now here, that's the good news. The bad news is we have 355,000 tons of plastic that never makes it into our curbside bin and goes to the landfill. So that's 710 million pounds. So if it makes it into your bin, it is recycled, and about 8% of what you put in your bin we call residuals. So the residuals are stuff like bowling balls, you know, a variety of things, toys, anything that's multi-plastic. Film doesn't work very well in your recycling bin because it wraps up the machinery. So you should bring it to your curbside. So film is the biggest portion of plastic that is not recycled, about 200,000 tons a year, give or take. So we do a pretty good job. Elsewhere in the country, residual rates are about, here they're 8%, elsewhere they're about 25%. So and we have a large industry that uses plastic lumber, plastic tile, injection molders, a variety of things. The demand for plastic is pretty high and has been through the start of the pandemic. So now, if it gets on your roadside, and if people have been driving around this year, this is just me. This is no scientific study, but I think I've seen more trash in the ditch this year than ever. Now, that's where you get the opportunity for it to break down into microplastics and nanoplastics and blow around everywhere. And the DOT does pick up a lot of that stuff through sentence to serve, but we don't get it. They don't get everything. So that's where the opportunity for plastic to enter the environment happens in Minnesota. Probably not a lot goes into the streams or water. People are pretty good about not throwing their bottles or cans or whatever, but we're talking about plastic into the water. But plastic beads, that may be at an injection molder. All factories are required to have a stormwater plan, and particularly that to make sure that the plastic resin, which is about the size of a BB, doesn't end up in your local stream. So.
So this is kind of a follow-up question by the same person, is asking, would it be better to lock up the plastic in the landfill rather than, wish cycling or risking that it can get into the environment by accident? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, here, once you put it in the landfill, it ceases to have economic value. So here's the other part of the, we have, now this is overall, all our recycling industries have about 18,000 jobs and billions in dollars of sales. So I would say no. Do we need to have better ways of collecting material, particularly film? Yes. There are other ways to incent people to deposit stuff in the right place, such as bag taxes, deposit legislation, and other stuff. Now, officially, the PCA, we are neutral on that, but they have proven to be effective in other parts of the country. So.
Okay. So keeping along the lines, the same kind of questioning. So we now, knowing what we do now about microplastics, it seems that we may need to think about how we can actively remove them from the environment, since they appear to be ubiquitous out there. So are there ways that we can remove plastics, the smaller variety, from the environment, either as individual homeowners or more, as society as a whole? And I think probably all of you have viewpoints on that topic.
Sure. Let me start with not putting them there in the first place. So let's take plastic bags, for example. Reusable bags are a good way not to create a plastic bag in the first place. So that reduction is, of course, at the top of the hierarchy: reduce, reuse, and recycle. So if we, and a lot of people do that. And of course, it's a habit. Make sure you have your bags in your car, and you wash them occasionally. And that's a good way of not taking a bag in the first place. So.
Okay. Janice or Elizabeth, you want to talk about your thoughts on removing plastic from the environment once it gets in there?
Janice, you first.
I actually don't have knowledge of a good solution to remove, for example, atmospheric plastics. The ultimate, one of the major sources is of course the marine environment, which, even if we stopped producing plastic waste today, would continue to produce atmospheric plastics for decades to come. There are some technologies being developed that could capture anything that comes off your tires. So that could be one way to reduce the amount of plastics that get emitted to the atmosphere from road surfaces. But of course, ultimately, we have to reduce the amount of plastics that are entering the environment to begin with, and reducing our amount of plastic waste.
So I can follow up on that from a water perspective. We see a lot of fibers from clothes. So use a lingerie bag for your particularly fleecy materials, or put a filter on your water coming out of your washing machine. If you're using a dryer, make sure that you clean the dryer filter so that you don't get the lint going directly out into the atmosphere. And maybe, although this might sound kind of weird, maybe don't wash your clothes quite as often, and use older ones, and don't buy new ones, because the older ones shed less. So, those sorts of things can help. And getting big plastic litter away from places where it can get into stream beds and lakes prevents it from becoming smaller plastic that's harder to grab So those sorts of things help. And I noticed in the chat, people are also saying, wear natural fibers, and that can help too. Although I can tell you, we measured a lot of cotton fibers out in Lake Superior, and I honestly don't know how digestible cotton fibers are to Lake Superior biota or what they do at this point in time. So.
Well, and that's, oh, sorry, go ahead, Wayne.
Oh, I was just going to say, if you Google, I was Googling filters for washing machines, and you can spend as little as $9 and as much as $150. But certainly there's, it's a very, with the popularity, of course, in Minnesota, polar fleece, which is polyester, which is a plastic, I'm sure we put a lot down the drain. So you can use a nylon, or you can use I think Filtro, which is made in Minnesota, which is $160. So it's all over the place, but the equipment is available. So.
So that kind of leads me to a slightly related line of questioning, which is so step number one, prevent the plastics from getting out in the environment in the first place. Number two, prevent them from, get them out when they're still in large size, so they haven't broken down into these tiny microplastics. But then once we've got all these microplastics ubiquitous in the environment, as Janice's work shows, then I guess there are concerns that they are getting into bodies. So bodies of organisms, fish and other species out in the environment, as well as some recent reports that they've been, microplastics or nanoplastics have been found in lungs and blood. I know this isn't a topic that any of you work with heavily, but do you have from your own reading or collaborations know about any work on consequences of these micro or nanoplastics getting into living organisms?
Yeah, I'll speak just very briefly about atmospheric plastics and inhalation, and then I'll let Elizabeth pick up. One of the concerns with inhaling microplastics or inhaling any particles is, of course, the size range that we find them in, because lung tissue particles can get trapped in lung tissue, particularly those that are less than 10 microns, although certainly we've seen much larger plastic fibers trapped in lung tissue than that. But if they're even smaller than that, less than 2.5 microns or in the nanoplastic range, they can move from the lungs directly into the bloodstream and then make it anywhere in your body. So this is not something I study, but it seems like the inhalation pathway, it can be a pathway to your bloodstream, which is concerning. And I'll let Elizabeth talk about marine organisms or freshwater organisms.
So what I know is they do get into fish because we found them in fish stomachs and intestines. What I don't know is what gets into those and how it actually affects or gets transported into fish tissue. There are issues in those organisms that can't pass the plastic very well. They get what's called false satiation, where they think they've eaten, but they haven't, and they can become thinner and thinner and not thrive in that case. In terms of plastic that actually would make it into tissue or into blood, that's where things start to get more interesting biochemically and way out of my area of expertise. But it is one of the reasons why there's a research interest in the smaller plastics, which we can't count very well, because those smaller ones are easier to transport across barriers, such as from the lungs into the blood, or from the intestines into tissue, or across blood-brain barriers, where they might do some very interesting things as well. One of the other concerns with plastics is that plastics act sort of like sponges for other chemicals sometimes. And depending upon how good they are at absorbing and then re-releasing the chemicals, they could act as a transport mechanism for other things that you don't necessarily want within a particular organism, trace metals or other hydrophobic organic compounds. But if they're really, really good at absorbing it and don't release it, they might actually clean up an environment or an organism relative to that particular compound. So it's a really complicated subject and one that needs a lot more study.
Agree. Agree. Let's see. So here's one. Cities represent a relatively small portion of overall land cover, say as compared to agricultural cropland. Wouldn't that also be a reason that cities are relatively less important as a plastic source? And I guess, Janice, this goes to one of the points you made in your presentation.
Yeah, so ultimately we think of cities as the ultimate source of plastic waste. So this is where a lot of our plastic waste is generated. But our question was related to how plastics move into the atmosphere. So you're absolutely right in terms of the spatial area, that cities make up a smaller proportion, or urban areas, than do agricultural areas. So yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, great. Let's see, there's a number of interesting questions here. I'm trying to decide which ones to choose. This one is probably, this is just a technical question. Can sampling, which is primarily for you, I think, Janice, can sampling tell the difference between a polyester fiber from clothing versus a fragment from a PET bottle? So same resin, different applications. Can you tell the difference in the way you sample?
I think probably in the form that microplastic would take, whether or not it's a fiber or a fragment or looks like a film, for example. I think that might help us identify. So for example, one thing that we saw a lot, we think are Coke bottle labels or Pepsi bottle labels, because one side would tended to be red and black and white and blue, whereas the other side was white. And so there are some clues that we can use to classify what the original commodity source might be. But if they're secondary plastics, it gets to be really difficult to understand what their original source might have been.
Okay. And someone wants to know when you expect the results from your tire particles will be published, and if you believe these results will be as significant as results from your work on plastics.
I do. I don't know when it'll be published. I think the potential to affect snow melt is much greater, even though the deposition rates are much slower. Also, I think there's a lot of concern about tire wear particles in particular because of their the compounds within and their effect on aquatic organisms. And so, yeah, I think it's a really important thing for us to quantify. It's a little bit trickier because we can't identify tire particles using FTIR, so they're harder to demonstrate that what we're counting or quantifying is in fact tire wear particles, although they are very unique looking. So that's just a little bit of our holdup at the moment.
Okay. I think you mentioned in your talk that there were ways to keep the tire particles from getting into the environment. Did I hear you properly? I'm trying to imagine what that looks like.
Yeah, so there are some companies making things that you can put onto your car that would trap any of the material that is coming off your tires and the road surface. And then you would need to change it out, every 6 months or a year or something like that.
Okay, interesting. Let's see. Does anybody know if folks have quantified the total accumulation in sediments of plastics and sediments to date, and tried to relate that to deposition and re-aerosolization rates? I guess that's primarily for you, Janice.
Yeah, I think re-aerosolization rates would be really tricky. As I mentioned, we're trying to find a way to get at photochemical age. And to answer your first part of the question, there's been a number of studies looking at plastic accumulation through time in lake sediments. For the most part, they've been in more urban areas. Our lab is currently working on a study to quantify in remote mountain areas that we actually had to either fly to or get special permission to access because people aren't allowed. We are quantifying microplastics throughout those sediments so that we can get an idea of what's entirely atmospherically transported to those locations. And so hopefully that'll provide a little bit of information, at least on the history of atmospheric transport. When did plastics start to become a really important part of the atmosphere and deposition?
Thank you.
I can just jump in and say that
Yeah,
we've been
please.
doing some work on sediments in some of the Sentinel lakes in Minnesota, and we do find them present there. And weirdly, not in the same proportions from lake to lake that we see for water column materials. So there are some interesting complexities in sediment deposition versus what you find as a plastic burden in the water itself.
So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I was going to say perhaps we should talk a little bit offline because I have some ideas about how catchment properties influence this process.
I would love to talk with you about that because I think that's an issue, because we do see a relationship, at least in water burden, with the catchment size versus the basin size. Anyway, preliminary, hot off the press, not yet published, so please don't quote it stuff.
Super cool.
Very good. So in the presentation, Janice, you talked about the effects of plastic particles on snow melt. Is it common to find plastic particles or fibers in like in snow?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
We found it.
Our study that was looking at precipitation and dry deposition, precipitation included snow. So we sampled over the entire year. So that included a lot of snow. And of course, it's not just what gets scavenged with snowflakes. And I had that image at the beginning and the end of a microplastic fiber embedded within a snowflake. That was taken by artist and photographer Doug Weaver. And of course, there's also dry deposition that is happening on the snow all the time. And so, yeah, it's very common to find plastic in snow.
Have you compared snow and rain, or?
So we did look at how seasonally plastic deposition rates changed. We did see huge seasonal variation, but it had a lot more to do with the location of the jet stream. We tend to see higher deposition rates in the winter here in the West, particularly with dry deposition, which is the opposite of what we see with dust. We tend to see more dust in the spring, summer, and fall, but we were seeing way more plastic in the winter, especially when that jet stream was dipping really far south.
Interesting. And Elizabeth, did you say you also measured plastics in snow in your work?
So we did a winter study where we went out on one of the local lakes and we pulled the snow cover and then cut through the ice and did winter sampling in the water itself. And we found plastics in the snow cover as well as within the water itself.
Okay.
I can't give you, because count statistics are a challenge, especially with the size of samples. I can't say that that's quantitatively significant or balance it, because we haven't done enough sampling and we aren't practically sampling in the ways that Janice is doing that would be more appropriate for measuring that information, but we were surprised to find it.
Okay. So switching gears here, we've got a few questions that are more about kind of government and industry responses to plastics. And this is a question about whether there are any federal standards pertaining to microplastics, either in the atmosphere and or the water. Do any of you know if such standards exist? I don't know of any.
I'm not aware of any.
I think it's still a little preliminary. So stay tuned. They'll sure be coming. Another participant wants to know how the plastics industry has responded to this kind of research and the kind of results that are being produced, not just by your work, Janice, but of course, there's been a real explosion, I think, of research on plastics in the environment. Any thoughts on how industry has been responding from any of you, actually?
I can start. I will say that the plastic industry has been more engaged in the last 2 or 3 years than in probably the last 20. they have made some promises on sustainability, and of course, then you need to collect the material to fulfill those promises on sustainability. So that will keep much less material out of the loop there. So there's also been a lot of work in terms of plant-based plastics made from cane sugar that are made into PET and bagasse. And of course, there's PLA, which is not used in water bottles.
Sorry, what's PLA?
Polylactic acid. So it's
Okay.
made from corn.
Okay.
So NatureWorks, which is a Minnesota company, is the buyer of that. So I think there's been some opportunity in terms of film to collect more film and collect it in better ways, because the consumer is demanding that people do a better job, or we all do a better job. So.
And do you feel we can be confident that some of these plastics that are marketed as sort of biodegradable or plant-based, that they really are?
Well, there is no biodegradable.
Yeah.
Is it compostable
Compostable.
according to the standard? So biodegradable is a term that is abused by a lot of people. So because biodegradable may have stuff in that doesn't, it'll break into very tiny micro nanoplastics, but it essentially really never goes away. So
Okay.
obviously there are compostable standards by the BPI. I'm trying to think what BPI stands for, but they certify material as compostable, and then people can put that on their products. So
wait a minute now, because now I'm confused. So if the idea is that even something that's called biodegradable is really just breaking down into the kind of
Right.
microplastics that Janice was talking about,
right.
And we're worried about these, then what do you?
Well, PLA,
Compostable.
polylactic acid, is compostable. That's one plastic that breaks back down into dirt,
Okay.
because that's where it came from. So
Okay.
yeah. So the whole compostability versus biodegradability, you always, if you're buying something, you want to make sure that it's certified compostable if you're going to put it in the proper place, obviously. And many cities or counties have places you can drop off your organics to be composted, which of course includes food too. But but if it says biodegradable, be very suspicious. So.
Okay.
I can say from my place in a sort of academic and chemistry department setting, I've seen a lot more interest in industrial chemists setting up recycling plants to break the plastics down to polymers that can then be reused. And I've seen a lot more interest in pyrolysis to take the plastic and turn it into things like oil and gas that can be used again. And I've also seen a lot of interest in companies actually as a selling point saying so much of the plastic is recycled plastic within things. And the neatest, niftiest selling point seems to be if it's recycled plastic from the Pacific garbage patch. Now, how actually relevant those are, I'm not sure yet, but those are definitely areas that are getting more play, both in academic and social circles, at least the ones that I see.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So we just have time for a couple more questions. Somebody wants to know whether enhanced, either more frequent street sweeping or better equipment would significantly reduce the plastics in from urban areas, either I guess as dust or that get into the environment through stormwater discharge. That's not something that's been really covered. I guess just getting the dust off the streets. I don't know, maybe that's.
Yeah, potentially. I think, one reason why we want to expand our study across the United States is to try to understand whether highways are a significant source in wetter areas. So, our areas are very dry or semi-arid. So does that change when you have precipitation throughout the summer season, for example? And we don't really know the answers to those questions yet.
All right, thank you. So a technical question, which I think is primarily for Wayne, and then we'll have one final question for the panel. So someone wants to know, is plastic film, which you mentioned, different from plastic bags used in stores?
No, they're essentially the same. But there is high density polyethylene, which is a very thick retail bag, and then there's linear low density, which is as you can, it's a lighter, thinner type of film. So your Cub bags or anything that looks almost see-through is a linear low density bag, but it's all for the most part polyethylene. And of course, polyethylene, of course, makes up your milk jugs too, but that's high density polyethylene. So, so it's all about the rigidity of the plastic. So that was kind of a roundabout way of answering it, but yes, it is.
Great, thank you. So the kind of final question, and then which is it's a Minnesota question, and so maybe mostly for Elizabeth or Wayne, and then if the panel wants to leave any final take-home messages for the audience. So the Minnesota legislature appropriated money from our Clean Water Fund to have agencies sample for microplastics in surface water and groundwater. The MPCA and Department of Health put together a work plan, but COVID caused delays. Will this result in water quality standards for MPs in surface waters? This is actually a three-part question. Do we have listed impairments of surface waters and TMDLs? And what are the next steps for Minnesota and the federal government to manage this pollution? So basically at the state level, does anybody know what is going on in terms of water quality standards from a legislative point of view? Either Elizabeth, have you been involved in this work at all?
Well, I'm involved in the groundwater and surface water sampling and analysis aspects and the drinking water source aspects. And that project, I believe, is going to start sampling this spring. So starting in May and going from there. My understanding at this point is things are so preliminary that it's very hard to set up standards if we don't know how to sample to make sure those standards are met. And so we're working very much on making sure the methods work and getting a survey of how widespread and how prevalent the problem is within these different water types to inform those who are able to make those sorts of decisions. So my point in this is very much providing information, and there may be others on this call who could address that more so.
I would say, since I don't deal with water, but I know people who deal with water, we're right at the beginning. I would call the Pollution Control Agency and ask. There are several people that are in charge or leading this effort there. So, but we're at the beginning, as far as I know.
Well, that's great. Thank you. So just to final wrap up in our 1 or 2 minutes left, do the panelists, do you have a take-home sentence or two for the audience? And Wayne, I will start with you. What do you want to take
Sure.
away?
I'll be short. When you have something in your hand, particularly a bag, make sure it gets in the right place, either in the trash or the recycling, because you're throwing away a job if it's recyclable. So.
All right, thank you. Elizabeth, take home for the audience.
If you can take a plastic and reuse it, do so. Take your leftover sour cream containers and use them to carry your cookies to work instead of using a new Ziploc bag.
I do that actually. Thank you. And finally, Janice, take home message for the audience.
Yes, I'll second what the other panelists said, but also I think what really struck me is that plastic is everywhere. There's no escaping it. We can't go on a remote hike and expect not to encounter plastics in our air. And reducing plastic pollution throughout our environments and in the Earth system really is going to take a concerted effort from every single individual on the planet and at every level of governmental organization. And so I think we really need to pressure our politicians to make the appropriate legislative change. And it's not necessarily a personal problem. We often don't have a lot of choices in what we use. And so we really need to make this policy, make changes that are policy.
That's great. Thank you. An important take-home message to leave with the group. Thank you all panelists for participating today. Thank you to the audience. That concludes today's program. If you enjoyed it, please visit Freshwater's website at freshwater.org to make a free will donation to help bring public lectures like this to new audiences. This lecture is going to be available to stream anytime from Freshwater's website, and a link will be emailed out to everybody who registered in the next day or two. So Janice, Wayne, Elizabeth, and all of our participants, thank you everybody and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.